So we're going to finish up chapter 21 by looking at some of the other lymphatic organs. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the immune response, of which there's kind of two types. There's called a cellular immunity, which mainly involves the production of different kinds of T cells that help to fight off infections, especially viral infections. And then there's the humoral response. Humoral response is involved in production of antibodies. I could go on and on for weeks about the immune system, but I really think that's a topic for another class. And actually, are any of you in here in microbiology? Okay, quite a few of you. You'll learn a lot about the immune system at the end of microbiology, towards the end of the semester. Probably, I'm guessing about the last 2 weeks of the semester. So I'm just going to mainly focus on the lymphatic organs. And so the one we left off on Wednesday was the thymus, and the thymus sits just underneath the pericardial sac, just above the heart. And the main thing to remember about the thymus is that the thymus is where T cells go to mature, to become mature. Okay? And I'll go into a little more details about that in the next slide that I have on here. But the T cells go into the thymus not only to mature, but they're actually trained. They're trained to make sure that they can recognize both an antigen as well as self markers that are found on our cells. There are self markers that are part of what's called the major histocompatibility complex, or the MHC. And in order for a T cell to mobilize an immune response, it has to be able to recognize both a foreign antigen and a major histocompatibility complex on an antigen-presenting cell. So it has to be able to recognize both of those things. So T cells get tested in the thymus. They get tested to see if they can recognize both of those. If they can't, then they're eliminated. And if they can only recognize a cell with a major histocompatibility complex, then they're still eliminated, because that's dangerous, because that could mean that T cell could mobilize a defense against one of our own cell types, and that could cause a very dangerous autoimmune disorder. Okay, so this next slide is from later on in the chapter. This is actually in the part of the chapter that's about the immune response. And this just kind of shows 3 different major stages in the life cycle of a T cell. Remember, T cells are what stimulate B cells to become plasma cells. Plasma cells are the cells that produce antibodies. Okay, so T cells, along with B cells, are born in the red bone marrow, which is found in the spongy bone in the middle of some of the flat bones, like the sternum, and also in the epiphyses of the long bones. And so the B cells get their name. The B in B cells actually stands for bone marrow, because that's where they're formed, and that's where they mature. T cells actually, though, are named, the T part T cell comes from the fact that they mature in the thymus. But T cells are also born in the red bone marrow, along with all the other cells of the immune system and all the other blood cells. Okay? So a T cell precursor is formed in the bone marrow, and then it enters the circulatory system and it travels to the thymus. The thymus is where the T cell is trained. It's not really trained, it's more like it's tested or challenged. It's tested to make sure it can recognize an antigen along with that major histocompatibility complex of proteins, which are both found on antigen-presenting cells like macrophages when they phagocytize a foreign body. So they're tested in the thymus. Sometimes they say that they're trained in there, but I think it's more like a test. If they fail that test, then they're eliminated. If they fail that test, what that means is they're not able to produce a useful, to stimulate useful antibody production, or it may be that they have the capacity to stimulate the production of antibodies, which could cause autoimmunity, which could damage our own body. So once they pass both of those tests, they then migrate into another kind of lymphatic organ. Some of them go into lymph nodes, where they monitor the lymph. The lymph flows through the lymph nodes. There's lots of B cells and T cells in the lymph nodes, and they monitor that fluid to make sure there's no pathogens in the fluid. If they find a pathogen, then they will stimulate immune response. Some of them go into the tonsils. Tonsils is another lymphatic organ we haven't talked about yet. They're found around the opening, they're found inside our oral cavity, especially around our throat, which opens to our digestive system. And they monitor bacteria that go into our digestive system to make sure they're not harmful. And some of them even go into the spleen, which we'll talk about a bit later. The spleen is a lymphatic organ that destroys damaged or worn out red blood cells. Since red blood cells are not much more than just a bag of hemoglobin, they don't have any other organelles like a nucleus, which the nucleus contains DNA, which can be expressed to form new proteins. Red blood cells don't have that. And so red blood cells have a very limited capacity to repair themselves. So they don't last very long. They only last something like about 2 weeks. And once they're worn out or damaged, they're filtered out by the spleen, and then they're destroyed by phagocytic cells. Okay, so some of the T cells go into the spleen. Okay, and so that's where they monitor the kinds of microorganisms in our body to make sure that there's no harmful ones that could possibly cause disease. And so actually only about 2% of the T cells that are produced are allowed to survive and go on to form helper T cells that can trigger an immune response. Because some of them just aren't able to recognize any of the common antigens. Some of them have the potential to produce harmful antibodies, and so those are all eliminated. And actually they get 2 chances to demonstrate that they have the capacity to produce antibodies that can bind to antigens. If they fail the first time, then actually the T cells stay in the thymus for a while, and they actually reorganize their DNA so that they can recognize different antigens. And so they get a second chance, and if after they reorganize their genes that they can stimulate useful antibodies, then they're allowed to survive. They're allowed to leave the thymus and go out into their various workplaces, which are the other lymphatic organs. All right, then the next lymph organs are lymph nodes, which are very numerous. They're the most numerous of the lymphatic organs. Lymph nodes are much, much smaller, though, than some of the other lymph organs, like the thymus or the spleen. There are about 450 of them in a typical adult, and they serve two functions. One is that they cleanse the lymph, they filter the lymph, and if there are any pathogens in the lymph, then the T cells and B cells that are found in the lymph nodes become activated. And when they become activated, they're able to trigger an immune response, one of which is to be able to stimulate antibody production. So this is a diagram of a typical lymph node. So the lymph nodes are sort of bean-shaped, and they have a capsule made up of connective tissue. And there are afferent lymph vessels, or lymphatic vessels, that carry the lymph into the lymph node. And there's an efferent lymphatic vessel that then carries the lymph out of the lymph node. And then there are connective tissue partitions made out of reticular tissue that divide up the lymph nodes, forms different compartments. And then there's lymphatic nodules that are made up of T cells and B cells that are in those spaces between those trabeculae, which are those cross walls that divide it up. So the lymph goes in and then percolates through the lymph node between these lymph nodules, and if there is a harmful bacterium that was carried by the lymph, or if there's a cancer cell, that's spread from another part of the body, those lymphocytes in the lymph nodes can destroy it. So these are located all along the lymphatic vessels in our body. Some of them, though, are more concentrated in some places than others. For example, there's larger numbers of lymph nodes in our axillary region, also in our neck, and in our trunk. All right, now, as it turns out, there are several different lymph node disorders that have different names. The first one is called lymphadenitis. Lymphadenitis refers to a swollen, painful lymph node that is simply swollen because it's responding to an antigen, which is a particle with a foreign protein. When lymph nodes are stimulated by an antigen, it causes some of those lymphocytes to start multiplying. The lymph nodes start getting larger; they get swollen, and that's called lymphadenitis. And that's just a normal immune response, so it's not necessarily anything pathological. But there are other more serious conditions that affect the lymph node. One of the most serious is a lymphoma. A lymphoma is a swollen lymph node that's swollen as a result of cancer, of one of the types of lymphocytes, and that causes it to swell up. And lymphomas can spread throughout the body through the lymphatic system. So there are treatments. There's chemotherapy that can be used against them. So it's not necessarily a fatal disease, but some of them can be treated. And then there's another term, lymphadenopathy. Lymphadenopathy refers to any one of the lymph node diseases. It just basically means a lymph node disease, but doesn't necessarily tell you which one it is. Okay, so because of the permeability of lymph capillaries, metastatic cancer cells can spread very easily to different parts of the body. And And so once a tumor is established in one lymph node, cancer cells can rapidly spread to other organs of the body. But if a person has one particular type of cancer, let's say a person develops breast cancer, if those breast cancer cells metastasize, which means they start spreading, and they migrate into another organ, like let's say the brain or the liver, that's still called breast cancer, even though it's no longer in the breast. So the cancer type is named for where the cancer cells originate from, not where the tumor is actually located. Okay. All right, then the next lymph organ are the tonsils. Tonsils are patches of lymphoid tissue located near the entrance to the pharynx. They guard against ingested or inhaled pathogens. Each one of the tonsils is covered with an epithelium, but they're not really surrounded by a connective tissue capsule. So that's why they're called lymphoid. It's called lymphoid tissue. And tonsils have very deep pits called tonsillar crypts. They're aligned with lymphatic nodules. And the tonsils sample the bacteria that either get inhaled or ingested into our throat by monitoring bacteria in those crypts. But sometimes those bacteria can actually cause an infection of the tonsils themselves. And if the tonsils become inflamed because of infection, that's referred to as tonsillitis. Itis means inflammation. And it used to be, like when I was growing up, that tonsillitis was very, very common in children. Even though they had antibiotics back then. And so if a child did get an infection of the tonsils, like in the 1950s, 1960s, probably early 1970s, it's very, very common just to have those tonsils removed. Because once you removed them, then you didn't have to worry about getting tonsillitis again. The problem with that, though, is that the tonsils do play a role in monitoring the bacteria that are inhaled or ingested. And when they do that, they can mobilize an immune defense. So if you remove the tonsils from a person, that may make them more susceptible to respiratory infections like bacterial pneumonia. So now most doctors are reluctant to do tonsillectomies because they now know that it may make that person more susceptible to infections such as bacterial pneumonia. So they don't do it very often unless a person has recurrent infections, like let's say a person gets strep throat of the tonsils over and over again, and they just can't seem to, they don't grow out of it, then sometimes they will remove the tonsils because it's more of a problem than it is an asset. But they try not to do that as much anymore. It used to be, it was very, very common. They'd tell kids, oh, you get to eat ice cream after you get your tonsils removed. And now it's just a way of making the kid feel better, I guess. So their tonsils actually, they're located in three different places. There are tonsils located up here in the top of the nasopharynx, part of the throat called the nasopharynx. Those tonsils are sometimes also known as adenoids. Adenoids are usually removed along with the lingual tonsils when they do a tonsillectomy. Then there's also tonsils located right near the top of the oropharynx, which is kind of the middle portion of the throat, right near your soft palate. Those are called the palatine tonsils. And then there's also tonsils located right at the base of your tongue called lingual tonsils. All right. Then the next lymph organ is the spleen. The spleen in the fetus before a person is born is one of the sites of blood cell production. But in the adult, the spleen stops producing red blood cells, and the red bone marrow starts producing it. However, if a person gets extremely anemic because they have a shortage of red blood cells, then sometimes the spleen will start producing red blood cells again. So it can produce red blood cells in the adult. Normally it doesn't unless a person is extremely anemic. So it also stores red blood cells in case there's a greater need for them, and then it will release some of them. And it's considered to be an erythrocyte graveyard because that's where red blood cells are disposed of. Red blood cells are filtered out by the spleen when they get damaged or destroyed, and the lymphocytes in the spleen break down the damaged red blood cells, and then they can recycle some of the amino acids that make up the red blood cells. Now there's two kinds of tissue inside the spleen. Here's a picture. Here's a photomicrograph of a cross section through the spleen. So if you look at a cross section through the spleen, you'll see some lighter colored areas, which is called white pulp. White pulp is mostly made up of T cells and B cells, which are colorless, and so it has a lighter colored appearance. There's also areas of red pulp. Red pulp contains a large number of red blood cells, which are stored in case more red blood cells are needed. So this is the picture of the medial aspect of the spleen. The spleen, as you can see up here in this cadaver, is located in the upper left quadrant of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So it's on the upper left portion over here, right next to your stomach. And the spleen is very, very fragile, and because it has just a very thin connective tissue capsule that surrounds it. And so sometimes if a person gets in a car accident, and let's say they're not wearing a seat belt, and their chest hits the steering wheel, if their chest gets hit hard enough, or if their chest hits the steering wheel hard enough, sometimes the spleen will rupture. And because the spleen is richly vascularized, it has lots and lots of capillaries. If the spleen gets ruptured, it can cause massive internal bleeding. And so that's why sometimes when people get in an accident, they may feel just fine. But sometimes they'll take them into a hospital for observation because if they've ruptured their spleen, they could bleed to death internally. Okay, and so they like to keep a close eye on people that happens to. So, and there's really no way to repair a ruptured spleen because the connective tissue capsule is so thin. It's almost impossible to repair. So the usual treatment for a ruptured spleen is they simply remove it. They remove the spleen. And so apparently you can get by without a spleen because there are other ways that your red blood cells can be disposed of. They can actually be absorbed into the walls of some blood vessels. but there are a lot of lymphocytes in the spleen. So if you remove it, it does make a person a lot more susceptible to infection. And so it could cause earlier death in a person if the spleen's been removed. So, but it's sort of the lesser of two evils. Do you want to bleed to death, or do you want to survive to live for another day, but maybe not be able to fight off infections as easily? So most people would probably say, well, I'd rather not bleed to death. So they don't have a choice because there's really no way to repair the spleen. All right, then finally the last topic I want to talk about today is something that has only recently just been discovered. And this is called the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is basically the lymphatic system of the brain. And this was only discovered about maybe 12 years ago. I think it was first discovered in 2013. Prior to that year, it was thought that the brain did not have a lymphatic system. Instead, it had a system that involved a circulation of cerebrospinal fluid through the ventricles of the brain, and also around the outside of the brain in this subarachnoid space, which is also filled with lymphatic fluid. However, in 2013, they did discover in mice that there were some lymphatic vessels associated with the dura mater in the brain of mice. And as soon as they discovered that, they started looking in humans, and they discovered that there were some lymphatic vessels associated with the dura mater in humans as well. And that's when they discovered this whole lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is more than just a system of lymphatic vessels. It's sort of a drainage system of the brain, and it works along with the cerebrospinal fluid to carry away wastes from the brain tissue. And so the way it works is that there are blood vessels that start out in the dura mater that penetrate the brain tissue. And in the places where these blood vessels, like this artery right here, where they penetrate through an area that's surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid. It's called a paravascular space. So this yellow space here, you see these arrows, it's called a paravascular space. And that's filled with a mixture of cerebrospinal fluid and interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is the fluid in between the cells of the brain. And this paravascular space is surrounded by astrocytes. And these astrocytes actually form a blood-brain barrier that prevents pathogens that might be in the bloodstream from getting into the blood tissue. And the astrocytes also help to regulate the cellular environment surrounding the neurons in the brain. Okay? So these blood vessels go down through these spaces, and fluid actually leaks out of these blood vessels, and then it percolates through the brain tissue in the direction these blue arrows are going. And as it percolates through the brain tissue, it picks up waste products and tissue debris. And then it goes into another paravascular space that contains a vein. And both the arteries and veins, when the heart beats, these arteries that penetrate the brain tissue actually expand a little bit. They stretch a little bit, they expand. When they expand, that's what forces this fluid into the brain tissue. And these veins also are somewhat pulsatile. They kind of expand when the heart beats. And so that helps to push this fluid containing waste products and tissue debris up to the subarachnoid space that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And then from there, that cerebrospinal fluid can go into lymphatic vessels that are part of this lymphatic system, which can carry that fluid back into the venous system of the body. Some of that cerebrospinal fluid also can be transported into the dural sinuses, which are filled with blood, through structures called arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi. So those can pump that fluid into that blood-filled space that's located between the layers of the duromod. Okay. Now, one of the things that physiologists think makes this important is that some of this debris that they pick up includes a protein called beta amyloid. And beta amyloid is continually produced in the brain, but in some people it starts building up. And the buildup of beta amyloid is one of the signs of Alzheimer's disease. Now, they don't know if Alzheimer's disease is caused by a buildup of that substance, or if it's just a sign of it. It's present there, but it's not really the underlying cause. Researchers really don't know yet. But one of the things they think this lymphatic system does is it helps to flush away that beta amyloid so it doesn't build up in the brain. Because when it does build up, that interferes in the function of the neurons, and it can cause central nervous system problems like possibly Alzheimer's disease. Okay. So it's thought that the discovery of this lymphatic system was kind of an important breakthrough because it could possibly lead to possible treatments for neurological disorders like Alzheimer's disease. If they can find a way to increase the movement of that fluid through the brain, maybe they could help to flush away some of that beta amyloid, and it might help Alzheimer's patients. And another interesting thing that they've discovered is they found that this fluid is produced more while a person is sleeping. So if you don't get enough sleep, then not as much of those wastes that accumulate in the brain are going to be washed away. That may be one of the main reasons why sleep is so important, is that it helps flush away waste products in the brain. Okay. So that's another reason for getting a good night's sleep. Right. Okay, now I have a little tiny video clip, and then I've got a summary slide on here. This one just talks about some of the aspects of the lymphatic system.
Highly metabolic reactive. The brain cares an awful lot about what its environment is like. If it's off just a little tiny bit, it stops functioning properly. We showed that the CSF goes into the brain just like people thought before, but it actually does so along very specific anatomical structures. There's a specialized anatomy that allows the CSF to move very quickly and very deep into the brain, exchanging with the fluid that's inside the brain and then moving out. So it's a much more efficient system for clearing the fluid and the waste out of the brain. We injected fluorescent tracer into the CSF, or the fluid that surrounds the brain, and watched to see where it went. The fluid, as it moves down the artery, is able to move right into the brain tissue. As it moves into the brain tissue, eventually, if you look long enough, where it collects is at the other end, at veins, which are another part of the circulation. Once it reaches those veins, it's able to drain out of the brain along the outside of the veins. As the fluid sort of courses between those two, in along the arteries, through the tissue, out along the veins, that continuous flow sweeps along particles that are sitting in between the cells. Amyloid beta is a protein that is made and secreted from cells in your brain all the time. In Alzheimer's disease, one of the things that happens is amyloid beta builds up in the brain and clogs up the space in between the cells. And it's thought that that's what kills the neurons and causes the dementia that's the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So when we first found this system and found that it was clearing extracellular solutes, we said, well, what solutes might be of interest that might be being cleared by this? And when you think about extracellular solutes that the brain wants to get rid of and needs to get rid of, the first thing that comes to almost everyone's mind is amyloid beta. So that was pretty much the first thing we tried, was to find out whether amyloid beta that's between the cells is cleared along this pathway. One thing that could be happening in Alzheimer's disease is this pathway is failing. So if because you're aging, this pathway stops working properly, or if because you suffer an injury or an infection at some point in your life, maybe this pathway stops working properly, and that ends up causing the deposition and the accumulation of amyloid. For treatment, it suggests that you could slow the process of amyloid deposition, perhaps by speeding the system up and sort of flushing the brain out and getting rid of the amyloid before it accumulates. And if you had, a brain that had a bunch of amyloid that had already accumulated in it, perhaps you might be able to flush that away or wear away those accumulations with, a higher rate of flow. So we may be able to try to modulate or change how this system functions to try to clear it more quickly.
Now keep in mind that scenario he just described at the end is still just a hypothesis. They still don't know what causes Alzheimer's disease. This is one possibility. Another very popular hypothesis is that Alzheimer's could be caused by a decrease in the cells, the cells that phagocytize particles in the brain, and as you get older, the numbers of those cells decline, and so that those cells can't clear those plaques from the brain. So we still don't really know what the underlying cause is, but there are a couple of important hypotheses that have been proposed. So another thing I thought of that could be a reason why some people get Alzheimer's disease could be because if a person, let's say, gets arterial sclerosis, which is another name for hardening of the arteries. If your arteries in your brain get harder, and when the heart beats, they're not going to expand. And that expansion is thought to be what pushes the fluid through those interstitial spaces in the brain. And so if the arteries get hard and they can't stretch, that may impede the flow of the fluid in the brain, and that could cause those plaques to build up. So, all right. So, in summary, functions of the lymphoid system include fluid recovery, immunity, and lipid absorption. Remember, the parts of the lymphatic system that absorb lipids in the digestive tract are called lacteals. They're lymph capillaries called lacteals. Lymphatic vessels carry lymph via the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct to the right and left subclavian veins. That's how lymph is returned to our circulatory system. Components of the lymphoid system include lymph vessels, lymphatic cells, lymphatic tissues, and lymphatic organs. Major lymph organs include red bone marrow in the thymus, as well as lymph nodes, tonsils, and the spleen. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 12. 21. Next chapter we're going to go into when we come back from spring break is on the respiratory system.